The Clockwork city of Harborwatch ticked and chimed in measured patterns, gears along rooftops keeping seawalls and lanterns aligned. Years after a festival riot caused by a power outage, officials wrapped every leisure event in rules. Steve scuttled beneath brass pedestrian bridges, his cherry-red spines sparkling in gaslight. Victoria kept pace beside him, her left-leaning crown of spines steady while her bottle cap charms clicked. They moved with purpose toward their next calibration route. Steve and Victoria served as volunteer calibrators for the broadcast valves, the network that carried sound and news between plazas. Steve wore tiny brass goggles looped between two forward spines, a neat band against his cherry-red halo. Victoria's carapace was ink-smudged from tide maps she drew to predict power surges, and her bottle caps clicked as she moved. When valves misaligned, fear spread, and they felt duty-bound to fix it because officials preferred control over repair after the riot. They headed toward their next adjustment, knowing calm depended on precision. On the way to the Hall of Entertainment Gears, they argued about a strange idea. Steve said he thought fruit snacks could evolve minds if given time and preservatives. Victoria said that was ridiculous and adorable, the kind of bedtime story told to a vending machine. He insisted found footage cylinders around town proved it. She said found footage was always a hoax, and they had bigger clocks to wind. Inside the hall, Shad waited with clerks, his dim gray coat dust-dulled and his sash angrily crossed out. Marge stood beside him with stern, scanning eyes and a bulging saddlebag of annotated clippings. Chadrick slouched behind them, his tuft refusing to lie flat. Together they ran the Board of Culture and Streams, the body that dictated what the city was allowed to hear, see, and applaud. The room held their authority like a weighted meter. Chad delivered a tight, practiced explanation full of words like structure, excellence, and measurable engagement. He said he had never been voted most likely to succeed and wanted a new definition that fit his habits and family traditions. Marge said the riot proved the masses were fickle and reckless, and only a fortress of subscriptions would keep order. Chadrick muttered that someday they would clap for them whether they liked it or not. Their reasons were tidy. The impact would not be. Their plan was a gear-laced trap. They would force everyone to use 13 different streaming services, each controlled by a camel-run kiosk, mandatory for access to events and notices. Lockhogs would check rotating medallions on lanyards, and valves would mute unless all 13 shimmered. Those who refused would be labeled disengaged and barred from the next festival. It promised safety and smelled like a muzzle. Steve and Victoria pushed to the podium and warned the ordinance would split neighborhoods, because families could not afford 13 of anything. Chad said affordability was a mindset, clapped once, and lost his sentence before recovering with a cough. Outside the window, a human Italian pizza chef tossed dough in slow arcs, flour catching the light. On the dais sat a tin cylinder labeled found footage, awake fruit snacks, and Steve stared. Victoria gently spun him away by his halo of spines, and whispered not now. They detoured to the Clockyard gym, where two rival pickleball teams held a tense stalemate. The clock hands had drawn tight lines like borders, and the spring-loaded llamas guarded their side with boiler-powered ball launchers. Trudy, a garnet-red Frankenstein, captained the clock hands with wrenches and lightning coils. Juice, also garnet-red, led the llamas with magnet drones and an off-tempo whistle. The gym sat under the broadcast hall, and the Cold War rattled ducts that Steve and Victoria needed for sound. Within a day, the Camels won their first big fight and passed the ordnance. Work crews bolted silver kiosks to corners while Marge oversaw with a red pencil and a whistle. When Steve asked how this served community, Marge said community was a privilege earned by compliance. She stepped close enough that her ribbons brushed his goggles. The message was clear: obey or be excluded. Chadrick led a patrol to the title gate and seized contraband like neighborhood bulletin boards and projectors, calling analog relics chaotic. He took Victoria's spare map pens and one bottle cap charm, dropping them into a bag labeled discouragement. Steve said this would make people hoard everything and clap for nothing. Chadwick said clapping would be regulated soon too. Steve's spines flared into a storm burst, and Victoria nudged him away before a fine. That night, they tried to sabotage the lock hogs. Victoria mapped the shafts, and Steve crawled through vents to swap a toll gear with a free spin spool. Marge caught them with a lantern and a smirk, saying mischief voided their civic credits for a month. She took Steve's goggles and locked the access grate. Their quiet plan collapsed with a clatter that echoed into sleeping streets. By morning, the pickleball standoff escalated and the crackdown deepened. Trudy revealed a serve machine that pelted trespassers with glow-in-the-dark balls. Juice countered with drones that snatched paddles mid-swing. Because Steve and Victoria failed, the board added extra lock hogs and muted 3 community channels, and whispers returned. Posters promised a rooftop showing of new-found footage. Steve said matey fruit snacks had formed a union, and Victoria said it was a sock puppet with a sweet tooth. Train grew in the dark as they weighed ideals against realities. Steve said if a fruit snack could think, then even cheap things should be heard. Victoria said policy could not be built on candy speculation while real people went quiet. Down in the gym, Trudy threatened to cut steam to the llama's side, and Juice threatened to reroute the match clock, which would also kill power to the broadcast hall. Their alliance felt thin as fishing lines stretched over gears. The feud peaked when teams stacked sandbags of old paddles and blockaded the maintenance stairs. Steve and Victoria had explained the camel's ordnance relied on the resonators above, and the blockage made fixing impossible. Trudy said the llamas had mocked her stitches for a week. Juice said the clock hand stole his best ball feeder. Steve and Victoria snapped at each other about fruit snacks until they fell silent, embarrassed by their small argument amid the city's growing quiet. Victoria took a steady breath and asked for a ceasefire to reroute sound. She offered a fair court schedule posted for all, a shared locker for disputed gear, and a ban on drone pickpocketing. Steve repaired Trudy's surf machine and tuned Juice's drones to a shared rhythm to show good faith. As they worked, Victoria remembered Chad's clap that broke his thought and the camels going foggy-eyed at a rally. She said softly that their weakness was applause. Interlude. Quick breather. If you're enjoying this Clockwork caper, show some love so the valves keep humming. Like, subscribe, and comment the word slop to tell the algorithm to stop clamping the shutters. Your support keeps these scenes clicking in order. They laid out a plan simple enough to hold under adrenaline. They would draw a crowd with a joint exhibition match and a screening of the latest found footage cylinder. They would trigger a synchronized clap with the resonators, so the camels would forget their tasks long enough to swap 13 lock cogs for 1 open gear. Trudy and Juice agreed to help, wiring coils to amplify applause and setting drone metronomes to keep time, because Steve and Victoria had treated them fairly and fixed their gear. The Frankensteins tested it by making a brass bucket hum like a thunderous ovation. By dusk, the team moved with pit crew focus. The clock hands and llamas set up a joint court in the plaza outside the streaming hub, welcoming children and grandparents to serve together, and a bottle cap schedule clanked on a lamppost. Trudy crawled through the hub's crawlspace to lace resonators. Juice trained drones to hover above the crowd and flash go for the clap. Steve and Victoria packed the open-source gear and reviewed vent routes twice. On opening night, the camels staged a ribbon-cutting with banners and a brass band playing for pay by the minute. The exhibition match drew a bigger audience than their ceremony. A found-footage trailer flickered on a cloth sheet, a grainy gummy with felt eyebrows waving at a spoon. Chad strode over to shut it down, sneering that unauthorized joy voided subscriptions. Victoria said calmly that public laughter was not yet illegal, and the crowd laughed harder. Chad used the plaza like a podium and lectured about standards, success, and meritocracy, his sash flicking like a sulking flag. Steve asked who had voted them most likely to succeed, and why that mattered more than children hearing their grandmothers sing. The crowd began a slow clap while Juice's drones pulsed green in time. Steve told them to keep it steady. Chad clapped to own the rhythm, forgot his next line, and stared at foggy notes. Marge tried to seize control by clapping sharply to set proper tempo, and the resonators echoed her beats back. Her stern eyes softened for a moment into perfect forgetfulness, and she stopped policing. Chadwick matched her energy, clapped hard, and lost his scowl to a blank stare. The drones boosted the applause until every kiosk light flickered in time. The trap had sprung. While the camels floated inside the applause, Victoria wriggled into the maintenance hatch and passed the satchel to Steve. Trudy pinched 2 wires with insulated claws and held a steady 5-beat pattern through the resonators. Juice's drones drifted in formation to cloak Steve's silhouette. Steve popped the outer lock, and Victoria slid the open gear into place. The 13-cog tree shuddered and fell into harmless rotation as the system hung between orders. Chad realized too late that his fingers had betrayed his mind. He lunged for the console, but the new gear had engaged, and the hub's safety clause from Riot-era reforms activated. Every public broadcast must be recoverable by single human action. Marge blew her whistle and got lost in the echo, and Chadwick barked for security before staring at his own hands in confusion. Auditors stepped forward to read out charges for misuse, while the crowd clapped on the offbeat to keep the camels harmless. Control slipped away from the board. The valves side opened and the city's channels merged into a single community library. Cool notices, songs, plays, and pickleball matches flowed without tolls. Steve returned Victoria's bottle cap charm from a hidden pocket before the patrol could have taken it forever. She pressed it back on her string with a small, satisfied click. Families drifted between kiosks and found them all playing the same tune of shared choice. At the edge of the plaza, the found footage finale delivered a silly jump scare as a gummy lunged at the camera with a squeak. The crowd burst into a jubilant clap. Trudy smiled as resonators stored the applause as a cleansing pulse that flushed the last subscription tags from caches. Steve admitted that if fruit snacks ever woke up, they would excel at rhythm. Victoria said they could file for citizenship once they passed a listening test. Juice shuffled up and confessed the found footage had been his prank, a jab at the camel's seriousness that became a citywide rumor. He held up the star, a gummy with glued-on googly eyes and a tiny paper bow tie. Everyone groaned and laughed at once. He added that the recorded clap track from the premiere was now wired as a permanent reset against future Lockhog abuse. Steve said that made the hoax the best mistake of the month. The camels faced consequences, not redemption. The board stripped Chad, Marge, and Chadwick of authority, froze their stipends, and assigned them to community service polishing grit from public gears under volunteer oversight. Their most likely to succeed memorabilia went into a civic museum case labeled Lessons About Ego. No one gave them a farewell clap. The city marked accountability without spectacle. Steve and Victoria let their disagreements slow to stillness. Steve said he liked believing in small impossible minds because it kept him kind to things that could not shout. Victoria said she liked evidence because it kept her careful with louder people, and both ideas might help a city that once panicked at silence. They agreed that whether or not fruit snacks thought, neighbors certainly did. Their partnership settled into useful balance. Harbor Watch changed in visible ways. The festival returned as the Festival of Open Gears with music automata, free courts, and a rule for 5 minutes of audience clap just for joy. The pickleball teams kept their shared schedule, and children signed paddles with bottle caps that clinked like tiny bells. Trudy and Juice joined the volunteer calibration crew. Rivalry had been rewired into service. In the months that followed, the broadcast valves hummed with stories from every block, and the found footage gag became a fond memory. Sometimes a tin cylinder labeled important evidence appeared in a window and played the gummy dancing, and the plaza laughed. The laugh turned into applause on purpose, and every kiosk blinked as if briefly remembering who it served. Steve and Victoria called that maintenance. The habit kept the city attentive and light. On a clear evening, the sea clock ticked softly as Steve polished his tiny goggles and Victoria straightened her lean left crown. He handed her a new bottle cap charm stamped most likely to listen. She slid it onto her string where it clinked comfortably. They scuttled off to check a squeaky valve, still bantering about imaginary snack citizens and very real neighbors. Harbor Watch kept time with them as they worked. All the slop in this video was generated using AI. This is a straightforward disclosure for transparency, not a celebration. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe. Comment the word slop to keep the valves open for future tales.